Welcome to today's teach-in, session number 3 of the webinar series, Engaging Informed Citizens, sponsored by the United Nations Association of Southwest Connecticut and the Westport UN International Hospitality Committee. We advocate for the ideals and vital work of the United Nations, which frankly touches all aspects of human endeavor, and so we strive for a commensurate level of programming. My name is Anvari. Tonight, I serve not as moderator, but in a role I just dreamt up. I will serve as tonight's progressorator. Indigenous issues are of great personal interest. While at Yale, I was program chairman for a pre-official university organization we called the Yale Association of Native Americans. The official grant of status came the next year with the name Association of Native Americans at Yale, ANA-A. Tonight, with our speaker being the president of ANA-A, this feels like my journey has come full circle. For me though, full circle will always be a drum that appeared almost everywhere across Connecticut. That long-lived group of Native American drummers from tribes across the Northeast made the quad at Yale Law School resonate in a way I am certain had never occurred before and perhaps never since April 1991, when we hosted 500 people to a day-long teach-in with 10 tribal leaders, illuminating an event called The Struggle for Native Survival. After Yale, I moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area, where I served on the board of directors for a hospital, the largest Native American care provider on the West Coast. Fast forward 28 years, post-COVID-19, the US still allocates less than half as much for healthcare per Native American through the Indian Health Service as it does per prisoner through the Bureau of Prisons. And if we compare Native American tribes with states, the 5 states with the highest coronavirus infection rate would all be tribes. I was also on the board of a legal advocacy organization called the Center for the Spirit, which means support and protection for Indian religions and indigenous traditions. We will talk more about the United Nations role in protecting indigenous traditions subsequent to tonight's teach-in. Switching to education, government schools on reservations have a 53% high school graduation rate. Matthew, our speaker tonight, an expert in all things related to Native American education, will put these stark statistics into a more comprehensive context. The Westport UN International Hospitality Committee defines itself as having the longest running community relationship with the United Nations. June 27th will be the 56th year our organization hosts hundreds of UN diplomats, staff, and families. At last year's June Day, we hosted 250 UN guests from 40 countries. This year, instead of an opening ceremony and a day of sports, recreation, and cultural exchange, it'll all be online. So join us 7 to 8 p.m. Saturday, June 27th. Connecticut dignitaries include our 2 U.S. Senators, Blumenthal and Murphy, Congressman Himes, and First Selectman Marpy. They'll all be co-hosting the United Nations with the people of Connecticut, juneday.org. Other exciting upcoming event is penciled in for July 15th. I welcome organizers, activists, members of this duocracy of impactful volunteers that we call aboard to contribute to the UN 75 consultation with Connecticut on biodiversity during climate change. This will follow the same format as our previous global consultation in partnership with Westchester County UN Association. You can find that recording on our YouTube channel by searching for UNASWCT. This webinar series, Engaging Informed Citizens, intends to counter disinformation in the fields of science, health, environment, and society. Session 4 is almost ready to announce. It'll be on a theme of protecting biodiversity in this epoch of climate change. Session 1 is available on our YouTube channel. COVID-19 exposes inequities in healthcare. What can we do as advocates for social justice? Session number 2 was titled Disinformation is a Timeless Antagonist, the comic and tragic implications of trickery in Shakespeare's plays, also posted on our YouTube channel. I urge you to watch it. It is quite entertaining. Tonight's session, though, is going to be very special. It's titled Combating Indigenous Erasure and Invisibility in the News and Education. And in this teach-in, we will learn about Indigenous identity in the news, equal opportunity in education, and the connection between today's race-related social issues from an Indigenous voice. To help us learn from Indigenous perspectives, we are blessed to have Meghanlata Gupta, currently an undergraduate at Yale, president of ANA and founder of Indigenizing the News. Make note, Indigenizing the News. Megan is also an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. She researches at the intersection of Indigenous education advocacy, federal Indian law and policy, and we're thrilled that Meghanlata is with us tonight. I will also now introduce Matthew Makomenaw, Assistant Dean of Yale College, who is also the director of the Yale Native American Cultural Center. He completed his Ph.D. in higher adult and lifelong education at MSU. Matthew's dissertation focused on tribal college transfer student success at four-year institutions, and he continues to create programs to help Native Americans to make the transition to and thrive in college. Matthew, it's a real pleasure to have you on board. Meghanlata, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alex. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be talking to you all tonight. I'm in my car because my Wi-Fi is out at my house and there's a rainstorm. So we're just enjoying this journey together. But I'm really excited to be presenting tonight with Matthew Makomenaw. He is great. And yeah, let's just get right down to it. I'm going to share my screen. Cool. Awesome. So like Alex said, Matthew and I tonight are going to be talking about a few different things, namely, Indigenous erasure and invisibility, but how we can see that through our news networks, and then how we also see that in educational institutions in the United States. So feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll try to get to them or answer them along the way, but we have some time specifically set out for questions as well. So hopefully we'll be able to get all of them. And Matthew, do you have anything to add before we start?
Oh, it's just very excited to talk with everybody, and thank you, Alex, for inviting us. And it's always good to have the chance to shine the light on Native issues, and so we're very excited about that.
Awesome. Well, we wanted to start first with an opening prayer. It's actually in Ojibwe, which is the language that both Matthew and I speak. Well, I'm still learning. Matthew's a lot better than I am, but thought we'd start with that. It felt very apt. Let's see.
Geshemenedo, eo na mewanan, maba sema, minwa undewananin, kudobgid na magum. Nigwech kdegom, the mishum sinanik, minwa nukmasnanik, chinago ga eajik, nangum eajik, minwa wabang ge eajik. Nigwech minadog eajik, no denong, eajik nibing, eajik shkudeng, minwa eajik akin. Nigwech minadog eajik giwednong, wabanong, jawanong, minwa etnungishmo.
Cool. Well, Alex and I and Matthew thought that would be a great way to start our presentation. And so another way that a lot of Indigenous scholars usually start their presentation, and something that's becoming a lot more popular now, is starting with the land acknowledgement. And so I want to state that as we virtually are gathered tonight for this presentation, all of us are inhabiting the ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples in some way. For me, I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan right now, and so I am inhabiting Anishinaabe and Fox homelands. Matthew, do you want to talk about New Haven?
Sure, yeah, here in New Haven, Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples.
Awesome. And if people are interested in learning more about the ancestral homelands, the treaties, the languages that were once spoken or are currently spoken near the place where you live, definitely feel free to visit nativeland.ca right here below. I always include that in my presentations because it's kind of like Google Earth, except for treaties, languages, and territories. This is a short little screenshot right here on the right of what it looks like. But it's a really, really useful resource, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in anything related to that. So moving on, something that Dean M, Alex, and I really wanted to say, first of all, in our presentation is that we also want to acknowledge that, you know, the US was founded on stolen land, and the US was also built on stolen labor from enslaved peoples. And right now, I mean, that feels really especially important in light of the ongoing police brutality and violence against Black peoples. So we wanted to recognize that Black communities are descended from displaced Indigenous peoples themselves, that there are many Black Indigenous peoples and Black people who are tribal citizens. And we also want to recognize that Indigenous and Black peoples have some lived experiences. And so this feels really important today as we stand in solidarity with Black communities and Black organizers, you know, across the country and fighting against anti-Blackness that's really prevalent in the US and around the world. And yeah, so moving more into a little bit about myself and Matthew, like Alex said, my name is Meghanlata Gupta. I'm from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. I'm going to be a rising senior at Yale this upcoming year, and I'm the current president of the Association of Native Americans at Yale. And I'm also the founder of Indigenizing the News, which is primarily why Alex asked me to speak tonight, and really happy to speak about that, and also the work I do on campus, as well as with my news source. So I'll hand it off to you, Dean M, to introduce yourself.
Bonjour, everyone. Matthew Makomenaw, Anvari, Michigan, and Dotem. Very excited to be here with you all. Originally from Michigan as well, and the old people, the students here like to tease me. I always use the hand, and people in Michigan know what that is, but apparently other people don't, and so sometimes I forget to explain that. But very excited. You know, I've been in education now for 20 years in terms of Native education. Working, you know, at the American Indian College Fund, Montana State, Central Michigan University, University of Utah, and you know, really working with my passions, working with Native students and Native communities, and it's you know, really been a life purpose, and I've really enjoyed it, and so I'm really happy to share a little bit of that passion with you all today.
So for the overview of our talk, this was probably in the registration link and summary, but Dean M and I really want to talk about the fact that, you know, in the US and beyond transnationally, Indigenous peoples are largely left out of conversations in not only our mainstream media, but also education. So we're going to be talking about a few different ways that a lot of Indigenous peoples are working to make their voices heard, and some contemporary issues that are going on right now, both in the news media and in more educational environments, like such as K-12 and higher education. And in doing so, we're going to talk about some stereotypes, some key historical moments, and also just really emphasize the importance of Indigenous-led movements for our own representation. And so again, feel free to ask questions anytime, and we'll really move into it. Matthew, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's good.
So we really wanted to start out with a brief historical context, and this is something that Matthew and I spoke a lot about because due to kind of the lack of Indigenous education in, you know, our schools and in our lives and in kind of mainstream society, when we do talk about Indigenous issues, we find ourselves having to go back and talk about all of the historical moments that led up to the things that we're talking about and the issues that we're facing. And so I'm not going to read all of these out in a list, but these are some key moments, I think, for Indigenous peoples in North America and the United States specifically. That's another thing. Indigenous peoples don't represent a monolith. There's a lot of tribal diversity. There's a lot of different relationships with the federal government and state governments. So I'm speaking on behalf of my knowledge, and Matthew's speaking on behalf of his knowledge as well, but we definitely don't know everything. So wanted to get that out there. Something that I feel all of these things are really important. Obviously, we conceptualize what happened with early settler colonialism as Indigenous genocide, and that has continued with the assimilation boarding schools that that we're seeing on reservations, and then the establishment of reservations and the ways that Indigenous peoples were limited in their capacity to practice their cultures, remember their histories, take care of their families, and have traditional practices, leading into the mid 1900s, where we saw the onset of a policy known as Indian termination and relocation, which is especially important because termination, basically the attempt with termination was to actually dissolve Native American reservations, and thus doing so kind of deprive Native peoples of citizenship and tribal government and move towards a world without, American Indian and Indigenous life in the United States. And since then, there was a huge resurgence of just Native American literature, solidarity. So since then, there's just been a huge kind of resurgence. We call it the self-determination movement, or, sovereignty movement, where we've had a ton of gains in literature and contemporary strength, resilience, survivance. And so that's been continuing into today. And really, it's been a movement for Indigenous peoples to define ourselves on our own terms. And I also wanted to note that these histories really coincide and interact with Black histories. The civil rights movement was occurring, a little earlier than the Native American rights movement, but Black organizers and Black communities, worked with Native communities when we were thinking about our own movements, and we have, long-standing shared experiences and ties. And there's also Black Indigenous people in the United States too. So we wanted to note that. Dinem, do you have anything to add on that? That was a lot of information, I know.
Yeah, and I'll be relatively quick. When we were discussing this, and I think, one of the things, it's important to talk about the historical context when we talk about the contemporary stuff, because then there'll be a lot of questions of why does this matter, but it's a lot, and it's also, we don't do it justice by putting these slides up here, right? Kill the Indian, save the man. Like, it's a very, it's when you learn about that time period in boarding schools or some of the other acts, it's really personal stuff for Native people, and it's really, hurtful, and they talk about blood memory, and it's just a lot of stuff that you really have to contextualize and understand what was happening as we talk about current things, and understanding that. So I encourage everybody to kind of read up on different things and learn a little bit more about history, because they really are more than just a simple actor. They're really, blood quantum, who's Native and who's not Native, and who, the sovereignty and the Marshall Trilogy, and why tribal people are not just racial, but also political people as well, right? There's a relationship between the federal government and tribal nations, and how that plays out, in contemporary times as well. So I think, again, we're not, the history is not our expertise, but we know enough to know, a little bit. But we really encourage people to learn a little bit more about that to really understand the present as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
I definitely echo what Matthew is saying. History is really important. The sharing of knowledge is really important. And so if you're interested in Indigenous issues and just thinking about what it means for Indigenous peoples to be more visible in the media and all sorts of spaces, maybe your own career professional spaces, definitely would recommend, reading some history, some literature, some really foundational texts. You can find those on Indigenizing the News, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about that in a few minutes. But we first wanted to start with a little bit of a background on, you know, what is the kind of contemporary landscape for Native visibility right now, and, you know, who are the players and things like that. So we're just going to share a little clip from this project, which will hopefully be pretty insightful.
Reclaiming Native Truth was an unprecedented national research effort. Never before has there been such a sizable investment by philanthropy in this type of research, and certainly in terms of its investment in Native Americans.
So we knew from the beginning that we were going to be doing something that hadn't been done before. It's our belief that the work that we do this year and in the next year going forward will really create a foundation of information and data the Indian country can utilize.
Data collection for the research project included focus groups, in-depth interviews with political, judicial, civil rights, business, and entertainment leaders. The project also looked at nearly 5 million social media posts from Twitter, Facebook, and blogs. More than 2,000 people responded to a national survey testing new narrative and message strategies. In addition, the project conducted 3 national surveys on the key issues and perceptions of Native America.
What we learned from the Reclaiming Native Truth research is that I think it affirmed many assumptions that Native Americans had, and that's that there are deep-rooted biases and toxic assumptions that many Americans across the United States hold.
Many Americans, including those in key institutions such as courts, philanthropy, and Congress, hold a number of biases about Native Americans, and many of these beliefs are learned in grades K through 12. The most toxic is the sense that Native Americans are growing rich from welfare and casino dollars. The study found only 36% of Americans polled believe Native Americans face discrimination. This indicates the level of discrimination against Native Americans is underestimated compared to other groups. The invisibility of Native peoples in everyday life, media, popular culture, K through 12, education, and institutions is extremely damaging and contributes to bias, discrimination, and institutional racism. In addition, these biased narratives set by others also impact policy towards Native Americans. The majority of Americans know very little about Native Americans or know any Native peoples at all.
What I found really interesting today is that 40% of people still believe that Native Americans don't exist. The real problem is when young Indian people consume media made by non-Indians and then measure themselves against it. And so it is problematic in our own communities if our children don't have the opportunity to see themselves authentically from an Indigenous perspective.
The project has yielded some very promising pathways forward. 72% of Americans believe it is necessary to make significant changes to school curriculum on Native American history and culture. 64% of those surveyed, even among conservatives, supported increased resources to reduce poverty, add improved healthcare, and education. We also learned that new, more accurate narratives about Native Americans work. The Native Truth Project tested messages on a number of Native issues, including tribal sovereignty, education, and the Indian Child Welfare Act. The messages highlighted values, accurate history, and the visibility and accomplishments of Native Americans today. More than half are willing to share the new messages.
Cool. So yeah, we just wanted to show a little bit of that video. But the key points that are really big takeaways from this, and just in general what we're going to be talking about, are, you know, there is a huge lack of awareness about Indigenous peoples in the United States and beyond. And that's farther propagated by problematic stereotypes and false narratives about Indigenous peoples, which ultimately allows for racism and systemic inequity to continue. And this invisibility has been cited as one of the biggest barriers that, you know, we as Native peoples face when we advocate for tribal sovereignty, when we advocate for resources, the revitalization of our languages and just social justice in general. But the good thing is that, you know, me and Dean M, and there's so many Indigenous leaders that are working right now just to transform these systems and to create a huge broader awareness of histories, cultures, nations, issues, practices, and really create a field of Indigenous studies.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add one quick thing. And is we talked about that history in that slide, and we didn't even go through all the history, but if we're asking for people to understand the history, to understand the present, but people don't even believe Native people now today exist, right? You can see the challenge, right? We're dealing with that Native people do exist and they're still contemporary people, let alone trying to talk about why a tribe might have sovereignty, or the Indian Child Welfare Act, right? And all these important legislations and policies and things that are going on, and they're not visible and that people aren't seeing or talking about. You know, so that's the challenge, and that's why we kind of really base this whole thing off of visibility of I see you and being seen.
Yeah, definitely. This is just a graphic that goes along with the video, but it's definitely something that I'm thinking about a lot in my own research. There's some pretty startling statistics in here about the United States, such as, you know, over half of the United States make no mention of a single Native American person in K through 12 history curriculums or science or English or, you know, whatever that is. And also that, you know, 87% of state history standards that do mention Native Americans don't mention any communities after the date of 1900. And so things like this really impact the way that people today understand contemporary Native communities, especially not having a ton of information about, you know, what these communities do, you know, how many nations there are and things like that. So that's a really big part of what we're working against. And a huge part of that is education. A huge part of that is media visibility. But I thought those statistics were pretty shocking. So yeah. There's also some other statistics on here that are definitely pretty shocking, such as this bottom one of, you know, 95% of like Google searches are from like the 1800s, which is pretty crazy. So we wanted to stop now. We know this was a ton of information to take in already, but just to see if we can take any questions or if anyone has any comments, things like that. So going into a little bit about my personal, like, specific work. So I'm the founder of Indigenizing the News. Also, I'm sorry about my son, everyone. I realize that that's not very, it's not very doable. It's in my eyes a little bit. But
It's like you're wearing a mask, Megan.
yeah, exactly. Just staying safe. But yeah, so I'm the founder of Indigenizing the News. Here's the link right here below. We're going to be hopefully doing something with that link. I'm going to be talking about this a little bit in more depth right now in the following slides. So it was established in June 2019. So this is a really exciting presentation because we're almost at the 1 year mark, which feels like just yesterday that I started it. But it's a digital news source. It's dedicated to Indigenous voices and contemporary issues. And it really came out of the realization that, you know, like so many of the people you saw on the video, that news, these resources, you know, really reaching out to people and building kind of knowledge, public knowledge of Indigenous peoples is a really good way of increasing our visibility and also raising broader awareness of both our strengths and also the issues that we're still working on. And so a huge part about this is that it's founded on the principle that an education in Indigenous topics, cultures, you know, histories, nations is important for everyone. I say, you know, on the website that it's a site that I hope is really empowering for, you know, my Native peers, my Indigenous peers to, you know, learn more about their communities and other communities that they might not know much about. But it's also really important because I'm hoping that it can be a space for non-Indigenous people to really evaluate their own relationship to this type of knowledge and hold themselves accountable and, you know, seek to become educated and knowledgeable and fluent in talking about these issues in their own places. of, you know, work and life and things like that. And that's been a really big thing, because I think a lot of people don't realize the contemporary strength of Indigenous peoples. There's 574 federally recognized nations in the United States alone. And there's 63 state recognized nations. There's, you know, around 5 to 6 million Indigenous peoples in the United States alone. The census is obviously this year, so that's going to be really important too, to see updated numbers on that. But that means that there are Indigenous people everywhere. There's Indigenous peoples in the sciences, in the arts, in history. You know, I mean, I'm sitting here in my neighbor's backyard, and, you know, my neighbor has a Native American neighbor and things like that. And so those types of things really inspired me to want to create the newsletter. Just because, you know, people don't know that much, and there's some high barriers to access for learning about these issues as well, because what you're bombarded with on the media is like mascots, you know, these, you know, old problematic iconography and images of what Native people are. And I really wanted to work to fix that. And so we have 3 action areas. I send out a monthly newsletter to my subscribers. But we also have original reporting. So I work with some editors and some freelance reporters who are interested in writing about their own communities. I actually have published both Indigenous and non-Indigenous writers. And so that is a part of the newsletter where I'm really trying to hold non-Indigenous peoples, you know, accountable and say, this is, you know, valid and rigorous scholarship that you should be engaging in. And then lastly, something I touched on a little bit earlier is that I provide a lot of educational resources on the website. So we have favorite books, some educational, you know, guides. We have that map link that I showed a little earlier. And so it all kind of comes together to be basically a little database of Indigenous knowledge, news, videos, recipes, stories. And so it's just become really, really beautiful and really powerful. And so it's had a really good impact. It's really great to see. It's really great to see it a year later and kind of observe the impact that we've had in a year. Like I said, it's, you know, empowering for, you know, Indigenous peoples to learn about their communities and others. Because like I said, you know, we're not a monolith. There's a lot of people who want to learn more about other communities, but it's also a really accessible way for allies to become involved with Indigenous news, publications. You know, what are the publications out there that talk about this? You know, who are common writers that you see? What are some good resources? And so that's kind of having a snowball effect. I'm just going to pause real quick to see if, I know there's a few people in the chat.
Megan, we have a great question from Eliza. What is the significance of using specifically a digital platform to elevate Native narratives?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is also something I've thought about a lot. Thanks so much for your question. I think for Indigenous peoples, the digital spaces have been really, really important for thinking about intertribal solidarity. Even though we're separated by, you know, hundreds of miles sometimes, or transnationally, we're separated by thousands of miles. It's a great way for Native peoples to come together and to be able to access resources and knowledge and connect with each other. And so that's been really amazing for me as an editor, to be able to work with people all over the country and also all over the world. But also I've heard, you know, that it's accessible, that it's, you know, not something, you know, that feels like, you know, not able, I guess, to be involved with, which is just in general a really large part about what digital resources can do for Indigenous communities. And also rural communities in general. Those are not necessarily the same thing, but there are some shared experiences there. So thanks for that question, that was great. And yeah, that really ties in with, I think, one of the biggest things that I've, you know, gotten feedback from some of my subscribers and readers is that it does really encourage a critical analysis of media. So I actually have a short little anecdote. My journalism professor from last semester had never worked with a Native person before in her, you know, decades of, you know, of being a journalist and also teaching. And so it was the first really like good connection she'd had with a Native person. And I had a phone call with her a few weeks ago, and she was saying, you know, I got contracted to work on this project where we were kind of highlighting some Native American youth. And I was going through the script and I was seeing all of these stereotypes that me and you specifically talked about as being really toxic and something that I know that you have worked against in your own newsletter. And so I just want you to know I made sure to flag those and say, hey, like these are stereotypes, and that's not something she would have known before we kind of made this connection and she had been involved with this news source. So that's been really cool. And then there's also the aspect of relationship building across publications, which is really exciting. Our latest project, which is something that's still in the works, is the Michigamming Journalism Project, which is actually a partnership with Traverse City in Michigan, the Record Eagle there. And it's actually going to be a journalism training program for Michigan's tribal leaders and tribal members who are interested in learning journalism about their own communities and learning how to have the agency to write about their own people and communities and things like that. So lots of stuff in the works. This is definitely a lot of information. Just wanted to kind of throw it out there. Of course, happy to answer questions, everything like that. But I thought now would be a good time to pause if you want to take out your cell phones or if you feel comfortable being able to navigate on the desktop. Just to visit Indigenizing the News and subscribe to the newsletter. Super easy. You can unsubscribe anytime. But it's, you know, only monthly, great resource. And just like check out the website, you know, kind of see if there's anything that strikes your interest. And I'll just give, you know, 2 minutes or something like that for people to do that if they want to.
So Megan, while we're waiting, we have another great question. This one from our attendee from Australia.
Yeah.
Do you link up with Indigenous owned and run media companies in the US, such as On Native Ground, or internationally, for example, in Australia, NITV and the Koori Mail?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much for asking. Right now, for around the past year, we've still been learning to expand transnationally. And so that's definitely a goal that we have for the upcoming years, you know, how to work with organizations in places like Australia and tribal newspapers and Indigenous news sources that might be a little farther away geographically. But as for in North America, we consistently work with Indian Country Today, High Country News, Native News Online, Indians with a Z, you know, a ton of different publications and things like that. And so we do a balance of recruiting sources from those places. And then we also try to include some New York Times articles, just ones that are done in some of the larger US newspapers as well, which it's been really amazing to see more attention drawn to Native issues in those. And then as well, I recruit some freelance writers. And so that's actually been a space where I've been able to take on a more transnational approach to Indigenous issues. We actually have a series going on that talks about COVID-19 for global Indigenous peoples, and you can see that in the articles section. But that's been a really important and powerful thing to be able to talk about. Sounds good. Well, that kind of leads into my next slide, which is just if anyone has any questions about Indigenizing the News or wants to note something they noticed, definitely not too much of a time period, but if you saw something, I thought I would stop just to answer some questions if people had any. Otherwise, happy to keep moving.
So Megan, we have a question, which is how much mixing is there of ethnic identity with non-Native Americans? Talk about a great question
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many ways to answer that question, and it's really, really complicated. I think for one, I mean, Indigenous peoples, there are a lot of Indigenous peoples that live on reservations in the US. There's a lot of Native people who live in cities. A large majority of Native peoples live in cities and off reservations, which sometimes leads to having more, I guess, biracial and multiracial, multi-ethnic families that include Indigenous peoples. I think relocation was a big part of that, urban relocation. I do want to, as I said before, there's a very strong Black Indigenous community as well. And that has a lot of implications. I was actually just thinking about this with a friend. But that we don't have to go into this too much, but that a lot of Indigenous nations actually enslaved Black people in, the early history of America. And so we still see some, impact of that today. And that's been an ongoing and more broad conversation, and something that definitely should be talked about in terms of police brutality and anti-Blackness in Indigenous communities as well. So that might not have answered your question, but I mean, for me personally, my dad is actually Indian from India, the country, as many people might have seen by my name, and my mom on my mom's side is Ojibwe. So even with me, we have that. So Matthew, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I don't. I think you did a great job with that, and this is a very tough question to answer.
Thanks. Cool. Do we have any other questions? Anything people noticed?
So Megan, I'm going to build on the question you just asked, and that's if you would just talk a bit about tribal membership as opposed to genealogical connection to Native Americans. There's many people that feel a genealogical connection to Native Americans, myself included, but I'm not a tribal member. And so there's identity, and then there's citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
If you can just illuminate that a little bit.
Yeah, happy to. I think that's one of the biggest questions that I receive from subscribers, and just making sure I'm not on mute. It's a really important question, and it's one that's really complex and one that doesn't have a correct answer. I think it's important to note that blood quantum, I don't know if people have heard that term before, but if you haven't, blood quantum is a policy established by the federal government that basically said, like, you're 100% Native to, like, the first person that they saw. And then your children, if you don't marry someone from your tribe, will be, like, 1/2 that tribe. Like, and then it would go on and on and on. And so that's where we come into this, not an issue, but we come into this added nuance of Indigenous peoples being racialized by the government in terms of DNA, and you're right, like genealogical questions. But there's also the aspect of indigeneity that is defined and celebrated by citizenship in a nation. And there's a huge emphasis on the fact that Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations are sovereign. They have a sovereign relationship with the federal government, which means that they have the sole authority over their lands and resources. They have governments. My tribe is currently going through an election process right now, just like the United States is. And so there's an aspect of indigeneity that is thought of in terms of citizenship and affiliation. And so this, ties into a lot of the Elizabeth Warren DNA test claims that you might have heard about, or in general, the tropes of the Cherokee grandmother or Cherokee Indian princess narratives or tropes. But currently there is discourse that, discusses indigeneity in terms of affiliation and family and, histories passed down and things like that. And that's how we like to define ourselves. But we also don't want to exclude Indigenous peoples who might have been separated from their culture due to things like blood quantum or, you know, lost records. And sometimes, you know, we've had entire nations, you know, wiped out by genocide. And so there's a lot of considerations there, and it's a very complex question, but something that we're still talking about today. Well, if that is the end of the questions for now, I'll turn it over to Matthew, who's going to talk about his own work, which is in the education spectrum. So I will move the slide.
Thank you, Megan. And great, you did a great job. And it was nice sitting back and letting Megan take all the hard questions and I sit back here and be quiet. And, you know, as a true administrator would do. But no, I really appreciate it. Megan's been fantastic in my time here and is always stepping up and really leads by example as we talk about the future of Indigenous leaders and Native people and to be doing this, you know, while, you know, doing our graduate in education and really making an impact and seeing a need and fulfilling it and not waiting until, you know, Megan graduates. It's really tremendous and I'm very proud of her for that. And so I'll do my best here related to talking about education. And this is, like, as I said, is really my passion. And I'm really, you know, it just, you know, I'm sitting here in front of a stack of books I just got. And so it's like my, you know, as an adult, we don't have toys anymore. As my kids get excited, but I got like 8 books of Native education stuff. And so I've been really happy these past few days. But visibility in education, right? And so we talked about in the beginning, and we talked about that, and we showed the video in Illuminative and doing that really good job of saying this is the invisibility of Native people, you know, as a new form of racism, you know, our contemporary racism. And it's really important. So I'm going to kind of build upon that as it relates to the educational field. And the first start I'm going to start with is related to data, right? And so we talk about, we shared a lot of statistics and we shared a lot of different information. And so visibility in data, whether that's national data, regional, state, community, I really ask people to pay attention to when you see data broken up or disaggregated by race, do you see Native people in there? Do you not see it there? Right? Is there an asterisk? Is there something that says, you know, not enough information that's redacted to not even being there at all, right? And that's almost majority of the time, is they'll show different racial groups, but they won't show the Native group in there. Whether that's too small of a number, whether that number's not there, right? There's this statistical significance, right? All this stuff kind of happens. There's all kinds of reasons for not putting Native data up there. It's just there's no really good reason, right? Because if we're invisible, we don't matter, right? We don't count, we're not seen, we're not heard. And so it's really important. And again, as I ask people is really start paying attention to that and start asking why, right? And ask an institution or ask a organization or ask whatever it is who has the data is, what about Native people? Where are they? Where's their numbers? And they should always share the end, you know, share the number, no matter how low it is or where it is. It's important to recognize that, right? And to understand where Native people fall in line within whatever issue we're talking about. All right, so go to the next slide. Or Megan, can you, okay, so I'm gonna, again, there's so much we could cover. We could spend the whole hour talking about education. So I'm gonna talk about college going rates, which is something that I worked on in my previous position at the American Indian College Fund. So college going rate is generally calculated by the percentage of high school students who graduate, who attend a college, any college, 4-year, 2-year, within 1 year, right? And so nationally for everybody, that's roughly here in the United States is around 67% of people who graduate high school enroll into some sort of educational system within 1 year. And again, this is where there is no national Native data. You can look at different other racial groups, but you won't find anything on Native specific data. And so I was working on a program related to this. So I was like, all right, I kept looking. And so I looked for different state data, and I just showed one here. And again, I'm not gonna identify all the states or schools, but just give you a rough idea on the numbers. So state data started showing anywhere from like 35 to 45% of Native students who are going on to college within 1 year. And this again is a select handful of 6 to 8 states. And again, sometimes this data is not really accessible or easy to find. It's something you have to really search out. Federal BIE schools, these are schools that are federal government, federally funded, generally, not always, but generally on Native reservations throughout the United States. And I haven't been able to locate a number of their college going rate. And that number sometimes will show up in state data and sometimes it won't. So when we showed state data of 35 to 45%, that may or may not include BIE schools, just depending on the state and the school, right? And so, but we have no idea about this large population or number of students. So I started looking at reservation-based data schools. And so this is, again, as Megan said, most Native people live in urban areas, right? Like, I was at an institution and we were talking, they wanted to increase the number of Native students. And they're like, all right, we had to go to all the reservations in the state. Not realizing that the most number of Native students they have was like 5 miles down the road in this, in the city. But for this purposes, it was easier to look for data with reservation-based data. That means schools where predominantly the students would be American Indian Alaskan Native identifying. And so I looked at 10 schools in specific, and those numbers ranged anywhere from 18 to 58%, depending on the school. And so now we start looking at these numbers, and again, these aren't numbers that are shown in the national data, so they're not highlighted and people don't know about it. But when you start looking at a school from 18% compared to 67% for the national average, you're starting to look at 45, 50% difference, right? And this is where it's a really critical number. And so if we just keep the, the math simple for myself here, if we have a school of 100 students, if only 18 or let's say 30% of them are going, that means 30 of them are going to college within 1 year, right? If we can get that number up to the average, right, that's another 37. Right, and if we start doing this by community, we can make it make a real difference, right, in those numbers in education. So I like to say there's a college going rate crisis kind of going on that people don't talk about, people don't know about, but and often in education they talk about a pipeline, which again I don't know if that's a word we want to use with Native people, but the pipelines, it's leaking within this case, right? We're losing Native students and we're losing them at high numbers and have been for a while. And so, so I kind of wanted to bring up to that. And again, and talking about why visibility matters and how it matters. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. And so the next part is visibility. And some of this was covered in Illuminative and some of the slides is the curriculum in K-12. And this was another, this is another source that they had and we just kind of highlight it, but I'll talk a little bit in general. And again, curriculum, and then we talked about that number in that slide at the beginning where most states don't even talk about Native people within the curriculum. And we talked about most people, again, don't think Native people exist. And we don't think Native people exist because most of the images that we see are from the 1800s or 1900s, right? And then one of the things I often do is I ask people to close their eyes and so if you all want to do that, virtually close your eyes and picture a Native person, right? And what's that image? What's that very first image that comes to you? And for most people, if they're honest, it's an image before 1900, right? Or 1800. It's not somebody who's like Megan or myself, right? In contemporary times. So we have a curriculum that doesn't show Native people. And if it does, it's based only in history and not in contemporary, right? And then it's, really the visibility in the K-12 system has to start with, and often when you see it included, it's always history or, it's almost always historical, right? We don't talk about Natives in science, Natives in education and technology, politicians, right? We have Native people in all kinds of areas, not just history or historians, in all kinds of fields and relevant in all kinds of fields, right? In terms of how Native people have influenced the Americas and Native people. So there's things there but the problem is nobody really knows about it or doesn't know the history or doesn't understand that part or doesn't really take the time to share that information. So, you know, there's some progress been going on, and whether that's Montana's Indian Education for All, or Oregon and Wisconsin, who have a couple state acts, or the state of Washington, who has information related to including how to include curriculum, Native curriculum in the K-12 system. You know, but then there's a whole other challenge, again, that doesn't get, that people don't really look. It's like, oh, great, we have Montana Indian Education for All. But what they also don't realize is there's still challenges within that, right? So there's, you know, when I lived in Montana, you know, there's a curriculum, but not everybody's trained in how to teach it, right? So there's, you must teach about Native people related to contact or European contact, but it doesn't tell teachers how to teach or what they should teach, right? And so what happens is people rely on what they know, which is often stereotypes. So now teachers are saying, all right, I have to teach about Native people in the curriculum. All I know is stereotypes. And so I teach, and this is what I do. And we perpetuate this, you know, vicious cycle of stereotypes and not accurate information. And again, I'm talking in generalization. There's definitely some teachers out there who are doing a great job, and we should honor them and recognize them. But in general, you know, it's the visibility to be seen, but also to be seen in an appropriate way, and to be seen in you know, a variety of venues. And we talk about a whole other research of possible selves, right? It's important for Native students to see themselves in somebody else, right? So if they want to grow up to be an astronaut, it's important for them to see John Harrington. It's important for them to see Native professionals in Native things, or Native career fields, right? And so we talk about the movie thing earlier. They talk about the not Native actors are not in the movies, or the percentage. We just don't, in general, see a lot of Native people. And then when you start talking with Native students, and they don't see themselves in different fields, right? And what kind of role that plays in it. Okay, now we'll go to the next slide. I know we're over time, so I'll try to be really quick here. And so the last one, I'm going to kind of wrap this together. And again, I shared the graduation rates in here, and the high school graduation rates and the college graduation rates. And you can see the difference for yourselves within there. I did a quick little thing about the employment in terms of the importance, as most of us know, in terms of the difference between getting an education and not getting an education relates. And again, not everything is a monetary driven, but we know that has, you know, it certainly has an impact on people's lives. And so I really like this last quote. I'm going to kind of share that really sums up this general idea that I was trying to get across, is when so much of our social and economic success depends on our completion of education, we must ensure that the systems of education are not producing inequitable conditions or experiences for students, right? And so this is where the visibility comes. If we're not understanding some of the challenges that Native students are facing in K-12, whether that's related to, you know, retention, dropout, to, you know, a variety of other issues, and as well in higher education, or why are students succeeding or why are students not succeeding? What's, you know, mascots or these imagery, what kind of impact are they having on Native students? If we're not paying attention to these, we have Native students in the education system where they're not in the curriculum, and if they are visible, it's related to stereotypes, right? And so, and then we're asking them to succeed in this kind of environment. So it's really appropriate that we shine the light on this, what's happening, and then also provide resources to increase those numbers and increase more students who because Native students want to go to college and they want to be astronauts and all kinds of other things, right? And so we got to really start encouraging them and showing them that there are people like them in higher education and careers, and really kind of build that up. So I'll kind of stop for you.
All righty. So this has really been fantastic. And I just want to say, in this education theme that Matthew raised, is that when Dartmouth University was founded, it was intended, it was designed to help Native Americans achieve mainstream success. And so, and Yale was not terribly friendly to Natives until recently. In the last 30 years, it's an incredible statistic that I heard that today there's more enrolled tribal members at Yale than there are at Dartmouth. So congrats to Matthew and to Megan. Keep this momentum going. A top-notch education is something that is yours for the taking. And you know, really, this storyline, I think, is something that really resonates for me. And thank you for sharing it, Matthew and Megan. We still have time. We don't need to wrap. If there's any other questions, I see one from Nanette. Are those self-identified numbers, no CDIB card? Megan, I think that was with your statistics.
Is that for the numbers of Indigenous peoples in the United States? Is that what you're referring to, Nanette?
It was for Matthew. Okay, so it was the stats that Matthew was quoting. Are those CDIB card or self-identified, Matthew?
No, those were from iPads, which is the national, more than likely the ones I was referring to from the national database. And so those are more than likely self-identified. And that's a great question in terms of, and again, it kind of goes back to the who's Native and enrollment. And but those are self-identified numbers for the most part. And like I was talking about with the college going rates, the challenge with some of that is there's a variety of different things with that. So the answer to that is it's more than likely self-identified. You know, and we talked a little bit about the census, and there's all kinds of challenges with data, whether it's Native alone or identifying as more than one race, and that puts you into a different category. So it's hard to get information. So we can say, if you get information related to Native specific, it's often Native alone identified, right? And so you might have somebody who's Native and identifies another identity, and that person wouldn't fall under the Native alone, so they might not actually have that number, right? And so we have that even within our own institution of different data and different things that we might run, is really having that challenge is, do we include just Native alone, or do we include Native alone plus people who identify as Native in another identity? So yeah, it's a complex issue.
Yeah, I think that speaks to some of the things I was talking about too, with citizenship and identity and genealogy and DNA and kind of the racialization of a lot of these issues. But yeah, it's an ongoing conversation. It's definitely something that's not, I guess, it's not completely cemented, and it shows itself with statistics and things like that. I mean, this is, you know, a little bit separate from what we've both talked about, but I mean, COVID-19 is a numbers game. It's a data game in terms of how important data and numbers are to tracking this virus. And so a lot of people right now, Indigenous peoples around the world are, you know, saying, you know, we need help with our data, you know, we need help with our statistics. We need to be able to get our numbers, you know, have our enrollment numbers, and be able to really work in this space. And so that's just an example, I guess, of another kind of statistical way that we're still kind of trying to figure out what tribal enrollment and identity is, especially because some urban Native people who are getting sick in urban hospitals might be noted down as white instead of Native American if they don't provide their tribal ID or declare their tribal identity before their passing. So that, you know, seems like maybe not, I guess, the most important thing, but for thinking about statistics, and there's a term called, you know, living Native American but dying white. And so I don't know why I brought that up, but I thought it might, you know, shed some light on some of the still ongoing issues that we're thinking about in terms of statistics too. I saw some, it's really hard to get the, oh, here we go. I didn't know if we had any more chat.
Well, I think we've addressed them. It's been a good level of interaction, a wonderful audience, and of course, Megan and Matthew, really, this very important information, and thanks for sharing. The recording will be published in the next day or two. I will send it to all registrants. Please feel free to share it, and let's keep the dialogue going. I think race, identity, culture is something that is very important issue across the world, and the United Nations, we're gonna have some more programming on this. So stay tuned. Thanks again, Megan. Thanks again, Matthew. And we'll draw this to a conclusion.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks everyone for being so active and engaged. We left our contact information up here if you have any more questions or just anything, if there was a question you might not have wanted to ask or you just think about later, feel free. And just thank you so much, Alex, for hosting this and for everyone for being such thoughtful participants and great questions.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.